I'm Dan Smith, the director of the Political Economy Research Institute here at Middle Tennessee State University. The Political Economy Research Institute is a privately funded, student-centered initiative with a mission of engaging undergraduate and graduate students with faculty and teaching and research that will further our understanding of the market economy and most importantly, its impact on the well-being of society. We certainly appreciate you attending tonight's event. Please make sure to sign up for our next public lecture. It'll be April 20th. It'll be Jason Brennan. He's a philosopher at Georgetown University, and he'll give a talk on his new book, Why It's Okay to Want to Be Rich. Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Claudia Williamson. Dr. Williamson is a Probasco Distinguished Chair of Free Enterprise and Professor of Economics at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She's also the Director of the Center for Economic Education and serves as an editor for the Journal of Institutional Economics and on the editorial board of Public Choice. Claudia has published over 45 refereed journal articles, primarily in the area of applied economic development and political economy. She is also a past president of the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics. Dr. Williamson will be giving a talk tonight addressing how institutions affect gender equality across countries. A big thank you to our co-sponsor, the National Women's History Month Committee, as well as the June Anderson Center for Women and Non-Traditional Students here at Middle Tennessee State University. We are excited to be able to host this program in observance of Women's History Month. Thank you also to the Center for Public Choice and Market Process at the College of Charleston. They included this lecture as part of their Adam Smith Week events. They still have a lecture following this event by Carol Boudreau on land matters, women, developing communities, and innovation, and a lecture tomorrow from Ed Lopez that I highly encourage you to attend as well. So make sure to sign up for those events. So welcome to all the guests at the universities and partners across the US participating in Adam Smith Week. And I also want to thank our Perry donors for their financial support that makes programming like this possible. Thank you from the bottom of our heart for making these events for our students and the public a reality. And I also want to thank our staff, Brian Delaney and Henrietta Bailietta, who deserve all the credit for doing all the behind the scenes work and organizing this event. Dr. Williamson, we're excited to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I am extremely excited to be able to talk to you and be able to present some work and, it's some of my own research and some future research. And I think that it is a very timely topic. And it's something that I think is important for us to have these types of intellectual conversations. And a lot of my work has looked at the role of how culture kind of underpins decision-making and how that impacts development. And now more specifically, what we have started analyzing and trying to understand is how cultural norms, institutions such as economic freedom or capitalism affect gender equality. And we're going to talk about kind of a variety of ways of engaging in that discussion. So I'd also like to thank, everyone who's participating and all of the co-sponsors for the invitation to be able to present. And all right, let's get started. So some of the more interesting and maybe unaware statistics is to look at gender disparities across countries. And so one of the, I think, more common statistic that we hear in the public news or in the media is that women earn 77 cents for every dollar that a man earns. So that statistic does hold up globally, and we'll talk about what that means and different corrections or ways that that is measured. But the thing for us right now to think about is that if you were just looking at women's wages versus male wages, it looks like women earn less than men. And whenever we look at paid versus unpaid labor, on average, women spend about 3 times as many hours on unpaid domestic care as men. And this is even higher in Northern Africa and Western Asia, where women spend more than 7 times as much as men on those activities. About 47% of women working age participate in the labor market compared to about 74% of men. Women hold 28% of managerial positions, 18% of CEOs are female, and among the Fortune 500 companies, only 7.4% are women. In political life, women hold about 25% of parliamentary seats, and women are about 35% of the world's STEM graduates. 33% of women have experienced physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner. So this just starts to give you kind of a broad stroke picture of the landscape of what we mean by gender disparities across countries. Kind of another interesting and kind of troubling disparity is to look at countries that legally require women to obey their husband. And so there are 19 countries right now, including Afghanistan, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. And then there are additional countries that require women to obtain husband's permission to work. And so what this starts to do is paint a picture and to show you that there are not only kind of these statistics, but ingrained in the legal code and legal doctrine of countries that create the disparities between men and women. And what economists and other social scientists have started uncovering are the consequences from these gender disparities. So when we, again, are looking across countries, these gender inequalities lead to, for example, poor health for both women and children. We have lower human capital investment, so there's lower educational attainment. We see poor quality of governance. Now, if we think at the national level or country level institutions, the governance tends to be of lower quality. We see lower standards of living, including lower income per capita and lower economic growth rates. So why is this happening? So we can think of it in terms of, why do we see that encoded in the law, something like you would have to ask permission to work? Or, just more broadly speaking, why is it that across a variety of measures, it seems that women are not able to take advantage as much of the economic opportunities that may or may not exist? A very common mantra that we tend to hear is that it's capitalism's fault. And so, it's that markets are to blame. And so markets exploit women. And so therefore, that is why we see, for example, that women make less money than men in the workplace. Markets tend to be a place that glorify success, which that's why it tends to be male dominated, or that there's just unequal benefits and women are at a disadvantage, or maybe there's some sort of consumer culture that would lead to gendered preferences. And within kind of that space, the typical preferred solutions are things like we must raise the minimum wage, we have to have gender quotas. So that's something that's become much more popular, is that certain countries, especially the Nordic countries, actually have engaged in mandating and having gender quotas for females to sit on boards. And we have government mandated family leave. And even in some countries, you've seen adopted government funded childcare support. And even some go as far as to argue that we should have some sort of mandated equal pay and required promotions based on gender. And so again, whenever we think about, we see these potential gender disparities that are showing up in statistics, and we need to understand what's going on. And on one side, kind of a public outcry that say markets are to blame. But when you start digging in and you start trying to uncover a little bit, in more detail, really what's going on, we start finding out, well, maybe not so fast. That's not actually what's happening. And most of these preferred solutions, for example, by requiring mandated gender quotas on boards, there's been studies that have shown that those companies actually do worse in terms of their performance, or that it doesn't end up helping women. For example, studies have shown that whenever you have mandated parental leave in the academic setting, that it makes the male more likely to grant tenure, and females are less likely to get tenure. And so it did the exact opposite of the intended effect as to promoting women. And so what is alternative scenarios, or what can be alternative explanations? And economists have a lot to say about this. And it's not to blame markets, but it's instead to understand differences in choices. And so whenever we start to uncover that, what we see is that most of these gender-related outcome differences are stemming from the differences in men and women's choices related to education. So the amount of education, the type of major that men and women are choosing, going on to graduate school or not, then the occupational choices, the type of work that is done, when it's done, where it's done, the number of hours worked is also a really important factor into understanding the gender wage gap. Time out of the labor force. If you're taking time out of the labor force to have a family or whatnot, then that is going to negatively impact your kind of long run economic earnings. But that doesn't mean that markets are causing the discrimination or capitalism is causing the problem. It's a difference in choices. And so that has been still somewhat difficult to get people to understand. But once you start showing and kind of mapping out this data, once you account for these differences, most of the gender disparity statistics basically go away. So Thomas Sowell has been great about identifying that if you look basically comparing apples to apples, there is no gender wage gap. And so there are still differences in choices. And that has led me to start to question and try to understand on a deeper level the social norms. Why is it that we have the persistent differences in choices? And so that has led us to start to question, well, is it really more about the cultural norms that maybe would foster gender equality? So what is it whenever an economist starts to talk about culture, what do we mean? And there's several kind of key definitions. The most important thing to think about is that it would be beliefs or attitudes or values that's going to have kind of a direct relation to economic activity. Also, you can think of it as customary beliefs and values that would be transmitted over time, transmitted generation to generation. And that is important whenever we start trying to identify what we call causal relations instead of just correlations. And so whenever we're talking about cultural values, it's something that would be more deeply ingrained and that is transmitted from parent to child. You can also think of it as values about the way that the world works. And it's also, norms of behavior derived from those values. So it imposes constraints on individual behavior, or it alters your incentives. And that then subsequently influences decision-making and outcomes. Economists have been trying to get a better idea and understanding of how culture relates to development and to gender outcomes. And Raquel Fernandez has a decent amount of work to kind of uncover these associations. What she looks at is what we call inherited values. So again, that idea that values are transmitted from parent to child. And what she finds is by studying first and second generation immigrants, so that's the idea of the values are being inherited, that it influences female labor force participation and fertility among second generation US immigrants. There's another kind of famous paper that has studied the adoption of a heavy plow. So we think about agriculture, and the use of a heavy plow leads to what we call a gendered division of labor. And so men typically have more upper body strength. And so plow usage requires more upper body strength. And so in societies that adopted plow usage in agriculture earlier, tend to have more of a gendered division of labor. And so what they find is that in those countries that have a longer history of plow use, we see less equal gender attitudes and female participation. So we see less female participation in work, in politics, and in business. And also there's studies that look at trying to understand values related to what we call family ties. So values related to the importance of placing your family over the self, for example, and that also is associated with gender unequal attitudes. A couple other areas in which this has been linked to gender inequality. One aspect looks at languages. And so what you can kind of define and separate languages into gender intensive And those languages are associated with lower female employment, and there is a larger education gender gap. The last one, which is probably not that shocking and probably is what comes to mind when you start thinking about trying to explain cross-country gender disparities, is religion. And it does play a role, but it is not the sole explanation, as you'll find out as we kind of keep going through these studies. So religious attendance and religious affiliation does predict gender inequality in education and other attitudes. And what we're going to do, and what my main focus has been on, is trying to understand one specific cultural trait, individualism versus collectivism, how that affects gender equality in terms of attitudes and then also social outcomes. So what do we mean by individualism versus collectivism? This was one of Hofstede's main cultural dimensions that he developed in the 60s and 70s. If anyone is familiar with Hofstede's work, then you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you who are not familiar, what he ended up doing in the 60s and 70s is he surveyed IBM employees across countries, and it had a whole host of different questions, and then he would categorize them along cultural dimensions. And one of them was this idea of individualism versus collectivism. So, for example, taking a quote from him, he says, in an individualistic society, everyone is expected to look out for themselves. However, in a collectivist society, people are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, which protect them in exchange for unquestioned loyalty. So another way of thinking about this is that in collectivist societies, the group is placed over the self. So if you think of yourself as an individual, and I'm imagining that most of the people listening grew up in individualistic cultures. And so sometimes it's hard to think about the other end of the spectrum, but the group dynamic, whatever that might be, it can be family, it could be your religious group, could be government. The group in and of itself, those preferences or values is placed over your own preferences and values. And so this has led to kind of other ways that we can define and get a little bit more specific in terms of what exactly would that mean? How would that play out? And so if we think about that, it really is a spectrum, and it's relating to the degree to which individuals are integrated into cohesive groups versus retaining individual responsibility. And so right there, you can start to think that, do you have a value or a belief system in which each individual self is an autonomous agent that can make decisions without having to get permission from a group, again, family, or whatever it might be, church, state, or do you retain that kind of individual self, the individual autonomous agent, and you're responsible for yourself? So from that, consequences that you're responsible for your own actions and the consequences that stem from that. Or is there more of a group responsibility? And so with that, you could have, kind of a safety net, but at the same time, the trade-off there, the cost is that you're no longer autonomous and you would have to be loyal to that group. Individualism emphasizes personal freedom and achievement. And so one of the important ways that we've seen this kind of play out in the economics literature, whenever economists have started trying to understand how cultural norms relate to development, is by emphasizing personal achievement and awarding social status to entrepreneurs. We see more entrepreneurship and innovation in those places. So we can think of kind of McCloskey's argument that praise for entrepreneurs is really what leads to more innovation and growth. And at the kind of core of that would be what we're calling these individualistic values. But at the same time, we also can call those capitalistic values. So you value the self, individual responsibility, that whatever consequences from them that you are, again, responsible for. You would value, your own individual or property right. And from that, from us being able to incorporate and kind of theorize, we've been able to show that this dimension of culture is the most robust when we relate it to a variety of economic outcomes. This is from Hofstede's original work, in which he maps out the most individualistic to most collectivist countries. So red represents the most individualistic. And we shift into yellow and green, kind of being middle of the road, and then all the way to blue, with blue representing the most collectivist. And in some sense, probably intuitively, the results are not that surprising. We have the United States and Canada and Western Europe being very individualistic. Some of the North African countries tend to be the most collectivist. So whenever we start to be able to get, kind of updated measures, or using Hosse's original data, or what we end up doing, what I end up doing in my work is updating that, those kind of results that show how much individualism matters keep showing up. And so here's this is just a kind of basic scatter plot illustrating the relation between individualism and income per capita across countries. And it is a very robust relation. So what I mean by that is that, statistically, we're trying to control for a variety of factors to tease out the correlation versus causation. And this does hold up to a variety of those tests. And so the more individualistic that countries are, the higher rates of development. And so again, why do we focus so much on individualism? We have theoretical arguments that link individualism to economic outcomes, and it is showing up in the data. So we looked at a scatter plot that shows that relation with income. It also is related to higher rates of growth, higher rates of productivity, the stock market, financial development, innovation and entrepreneurship. Individualism is also negatively related to business and financial regulation. So countries that are more individualistic have lower rates of regulation, even though they have better outcomes in terms of development. And we also see that individualistic countries have more economic and political freedom. So then how do we take this argument, or this kind of notion of individualism, and relate it to gender equality? So our main hypothesis is that collectivism is equal to patriarchy. And so when we started researching this and really trying to get a better understanding of norms related to, if you want to think of it as feminism, or related to wanting to make sure that men and women are equal, not advancing one group over the other, but that men and women are treated equally, we find that feminism has deep roots in the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment ideas, the Enlightenment thinking about individual liberty and natural rights, and that we are free individuals, we see arguments within the Enlightenment as that not only should that be applied to men, but radically, it should be also applied to women. And so those were, in some sense, you can think of it as the original feminists. Through the Enlightenment period, what we see is arguments based on natural liberty and individual liberty, that we are free individuals, not just men, but also women. Unfortunately, not all of those ideas have taken hold of across the globe, including that extension to women. So what we argue is that values of individualistic societies, autonomy, self-expression, creativity, that ethos of individual rights are inherently egalitarian, and it transcends gender identity. And so we can think of it as, if those are your core values and somewhat of a foundational belief system, then you wouldn't stop at picking a race or a gender, that it would kind of be elevated above that. And the core of it is about an individual. And so that's kind of the main core of our thesis, is that values related to individualism would transcend gender identity. However, the web of relationships and obligations that would characterize collectivist societies may ascribe subordinate roles to women. So it could de-emphasize women's personal goals relative to the group. So again, probably the easiest example to think there is something like family. And so that a woman's individual goals and preferences no longer matter. Her role is to elevate the family, to take care of the family as the group. And so those would tend to be more aligned with what we think of as collectivist values. So it's not about individual autonomy or female individual autonomy anymore. It's about the collective family. So if collectives are patriarchal, then a society that emphasizes family or tribe or the nation or church relative to the individual would subordinate women. If that's the case, if collectivism does equal patriarchy, collectivist societies emphasize social networks and obligations, and so we expect them to have less female autonomy. We would expect to see higher support for patriarchal attitudes, meaning things like, and we're going to measure and get a little bit more specific, but just things like that, woman's places in the home. So that's what we mean by the attitudes, the norms that would relate to patriarchy, for example. We would expect to see in collectivist societies a greater gender division of labor. So women do certain types of work and men do certain type of work. And we would then also expect to see an increase in a gender education gap. However, in an individualistic society that is focusing on self-autonomy and individual rights, what we would then expect to see, if we're correct, that individualism is elevating above gender identities, then we expect to see stronger support for women as individuals, and those individual rights should be extended to them. They are equal to men. We would expect to then see more acceptance of gender equal attitudes toward employment, toward earnings, toward education, toward politics, for example. We expect to see lower support for a gender division of labor. So women as mothers and caregivers rather than working outside the home. So in an individualistic society, we would expect to see women being able to work outside the home. In collectivist society, they would be subordinated to the mothers and caregivers. In collectivist or in individualistic society, we would expect to see an increase in female educational attainment, and also we hypothesize lower female fertility, because in a decent amount of work that's coming out, it is arguing that by having fewer children, it enables women to work outside the home. Again, fertility oftentimes is a choice. And so that one is more related to prior work in terms of understanding the relation between kind of female autonomy and whether it's in home or outside the home employment. So how do we get at kind of uncovering these very complicated dynamics? We use a world values survey. So what World Values Survey has been conducted since 1981. And then we are going to first use individual level data, and then we're going to look at it at the country level. And we do this for a variety of reasons, and it's to give more kind of support and to give us a more robust belief that the associations that we're uncovering are real and they're not just anomalies in the data that we happen to be looking at. So World Values Survey has surveyed over 350,000 individuals since 1981, over 100 countries, and it covers about 90% of the world's population. Ideally, we would have more countries surveyed, but this is the data that we have right now. And they are continually updating it. The most recent wave did just get published, and so it is not in this initial body of work, but we are going to extend that to see what other countries we could potentially include. And so again, we're going to initially look at individual level responses from those surveys, and the surveys contain a whole host of information related to these kind of patriarchal attitudes, related to individualism, collectivism, related to employment, related to number of kids, as well as the demographic and economic information. So the way that we measure individualism is, you can think of it as we are trying to stay as true to Hofstede as possible, but we want to update his measure because it is more current, but also in order to be able to do this individual level analysis, we need to stay within and try to contain data or utilize data that's within the survey. And by doing so, we're able to also expand the scope of his original work. And so what we do is that we try to match survey questions to values. So again, we can think about kind of mapping out those individualistic values. As Hofstede described, you would have a right to a private life. So that was something that he described as being individualistic. Weaker family ties. So you see yourself as maybe a family member, but it's still individual as part of a group, not group over the individual. He also discussed there would be less conformity in behavior so that you feel the ability and acceptance if you are a little bit more creative or you think outside the lines, things like that. That you focus on individual incentives, individual responsibility, and that you value, and again, this comes from Hofstede, you value market capitalism and competition. So the competition is a good thing. That's baked into your value system. And so what we do, there's questions from World Value Survey we utilize to try to capture those values. There's 4 different ones. The first one relates to private versus government ownership of business. The second one is related to this idea of family ties. And it asks if one of the main goals in life is to make your parents proud. And then the other 2 is related to if these activities are ever justifiable. So one of them is related to if abortion is ever justifiable, and the second one is related to if homosexuality is ever justifiable. The reason why we include these, and these are based on other academic papers, the idea there is to also try to minimize noise in the survey data by using questions that aren't directly related to something like tolerance. So there are questions related to tolerance, for example. The issue is you don't get as much variation. So this is a kind of indirect way of measuring the values, where what we're trying to say is something that may be in your own personal moral code you consider wrong, but other people can engage in that. And so that's what we're trying to measure the right to private life and less conformity is by including these types of questions. We'll talk about other questions that we include. We drop the abortion and homosexuality questions out and the results hold. But initially, this is the way that we measure individualism using World Value Survey. Sweden, Netherlands, and Germany are the most individualistic with this data. Egypt, India, and Jordan are the most collectivist. So how do we measure patriarchal attitudes? There are 4 questions that we initially use, and they're basically stated, do you agree that? And the first one is when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. The second question is, on the whole, men make better political leaders than women do. Third question, related to education, a university education is more important for a boy than a girl. And the last question is, it is a problem if women have more income than husbands. And so this collectively, we both with the questions on individualism and on these patriarchal attitudes, we create an overall index. So we put them together in an overall index where, in this case, a higher number would mean greater support for gender inequality. And so again, the way that it's measured is in terms of patriarchal attitudes. So a higher number on this index means that you have more attitudes that would support gender inequality. We also are then going to relate it to social outcomes. So we're going to relate individualism to the patriarchal attitudes, and we're also going to relate it to number of kids. So fertility, we're going to look at female employment. So basically what we do is it's just the binary variable equal to 1 if the female respondent is full-time employed, part-time, or self-employed. And so even if they list them as self-employed, we're going to consider that as employed. We also look at female educational attainment. And the way that it's asked in the survey is not ideal. So we basically convert that to number of years of schooling. And what we see is that by doing that, female schooling ranges from basically 3 years to 16 years with a mean of about 11 years of schooling. So we also collect data on their age. We include age squared. We include if they are married, if the respondent is female. We include their level of income and also then their level of education. And so this may result in what we would call over-controlling, as some of these characteristics are what we're going to be called endogenous, so they're going to be correlated with each other, and they would be correlated with gendered attitudes or the gender division of labor. But if that's true, then we would actually be underestimating the effect of individualism. So the other important point to mention on these initial set of results that we're going to walk through is that you got to remember what we're collecting this at the individual level. So what we're eventually going to do is aggregate all of those individual responses within a country up to the national level, and then we'll have cross-country comparisons. But right now we're looking at basically individual to individual. And so we control for country fixed effects. We're going to control for year fixed effects. So we're looking at kind of within country analysis, which eliminates the impact of other national, cultural, or institutional variables. So again, we're comparing individualism related to outcomes for people or an individual with the same age, the same gender, the same country, and the same time period. So we're really kind of stripping it down to try to see if we can gauge and find a relation there. The problem with that is that it misses the effect of culture on country level outcomes. So we do know political and economic institutions and policies and development can impact that. So that's kind of the second step that we're going to look at in a second. So our main results is that these values, individualism, is associated with more equal attitudes toward women. So we think of our patriarchal index, and in countries with individuals that are more individualistic, they have values associated with individualism or associated with capitalism, we see a reduction in that patriarchy attitudes index. We also see a reduction in fertility. So all these are statistically and economically significant. We see increases in female labor force participation. So they are working outside the home by about 3.6%. And if you have an increase in individualism of the standard deviation, it would increase female educational attainment by about an additional half year of schooling. So again, some of you may be wondering about the way we're measuring individualism, but you don't need to be worried over there. We look at different components of the individualism index. So if you remember, we had 4 different questions in there. One of them was about private versus government ownership of business. And then we also had a question in there about making parents proud. Those two, so if you have a preference for government or state ownership, and one of the main goals in your life is to make your parents proud, that is positively related kind of to the patriarchy attitude, so traditional attitudes toward women. Whereas tolerance for homosexuality or abortion are negative and significantly associated with individualism. So they load in the ways that we would expect them to. Since kind of tolerance toward homosexuality and abortion could be co-determined with gender attitudes, we drop those out and we just combine state ownership and then making parents proud as their own index. Results are unchanged. We also look at a different question related directly to individual versus government responsibility. And that loads and is significant in the same way that we would expect it to. And so again, when we're picking out questions that we think relate to individualistic values, it is robust in terms of it doesn't require one particular question. If we swap them in and out, they load in the ways that we would expect them to. One of the other areas that we look at is to try to uncover a relation with the gender division of labor. So there's 2 more questions than we analyze. There's a question that states, a preschool child is likely to suffer if his or her mother works. And so we would expect that individualistic values to kind of decrease that. And then there's a second question that states being a housewife is just as fulfilling as working for pay. And so we consider both of these to relate to what we would call gender division of labor or traditional working roles where women are working inside the home and men are working outside the home. And when we do the kind of the same type of analysis, again, individual to individual, so all these are still at the individual level in terms of our survey responses, individualism negatively and significantly decreases attitudes toward a gender division of labor. So then we would expect women, and as was shown prior in our couple slides ago, that women do then work outside the home when they hold these types of values. Other things that we do is to control for religion. We control for historical plow use. We talked about how that sets up a long run kind of gender division of labor in those countries. We control for if the individuals speak a gendered language, and individualism still matters. The economic significance, the estimated size of the effect is reduced depending on the specification, but overall, we are still finding that individuals who hold capitalistic or individualistic values also tend to have attitudes toward women that are more equal toward men. So basically, we're, again, think of it as providing support to the argument that individualistic values are elevating or transcending gender identities. We see that women tend to work outside the home. There's more female educational attainment, less fertility, and that there's less gender division of labor attitudes. We also engage, again, in trying to separate correlation versus causality, because individualism is likely to be co-determined, or individualistic values with values regarding gender. So economic development is always a concern, especially when we're doing things across countries. We are able to control for country level economic development because we have those country fixed effects in there. But within country, there's still variation. So you can think urban versus rural populations or subnational regional development that we could potentially miss. So we do variety of tests. We instrument for individualism using rainfall variation. If anyone's interested, I can go into more detail on that. But the main and more exciting part to talk about is that we do find support that this association is causal. It is not just picking up on a correlation, so that individualistic values, it runs in the direction that it is causing these outcomes. And so the other thing that we find is a much larger effect. So I mentioned, because in the initial setup, we're controlling for a variety of factors, that we could be underestimating the effect. And that does seem, these results support that. So a 1 standard deviation, for example, increase in individualism leads to almost a standard deviation reduction in that patriarchal attitudes index. Fertility is now reduced by 1 child. It increases the probability that a woman is employed outside the home by 24%, so it's a huge effect. And it's associated with over 2 additional years of schooling. So I mentioned that this is, individual level results. And now what we do is we basically can aggregate all of those individual level responses up to their country level. And so we're no longer going to miss out on those country level outcomes. And so what we can do then is also control and analyze things like economic freedom, democracy, and the legal system. Quickly showing you our patriarchal attitudes index, the consequences of countries that have attitudes that are classified as being more patriarchal are poor. And so this is something that we think is important to emphasize. In prior works, they've documented something like if there's less female labor force participation, we have less income, and those countries grow slower. But what this is doing is showing that if you hold attitudes, for example, that you don't think women are as great as leaders, then you're also, so those countries are also poor. Looking at the association between individualism and our patriarchal attitudes at the country level, controlling for now economic freedom, democracy, common law, the result is still there. And so why this is important is individualism is also associated with a system of capitalism. So we're thinking about individualistic values being capitalistic values. And we're thinking then that's also going to translate into a formal system of capitalism, so basically economic freedom, and it does, there's work showing that. And individualism also supports political freedom, so democracy. And so maybe then our result was simply people that live in economically and politically free countries have those outcomes. And this is saying we're controlling for all of that, and this result still holds, that individualistic values reduce patriarchal attitudes. It reduces female fertility, it increases female employment, and it increases female educational attainment. So to summarize all of that, so what we're doing now at the country level, and we're controlling for culture, we're analyzing capitalism with the Economic Freedom of the World Index. We're looking at political freedom, so if countries are democratic or autocratic, and we're also including if countries are have a common law or a civil law system. So when we look at and relate those to patriarchal attitudes, what we find is that individualism, economic freedom, and democracy significantly reduce those types of attitudes. Common law ends up not being important, statistically important here. So why that's important, the initial takeaway, the way to think about it is economic freedom and democracy is not stripping away the importance of having those types of values. And if anything, what we believe, what we're picking up on is that individualism is kind of causing the others. And so they all matter in this case, but culture kind of is still providing the foundation for those liberties. And for female fertility, individualism ends up being the only one that matters. For female employment, we find that individualism, again, significantly increases women working outside the home, and turns out democracy significantly decreases female working outside the home. Economic freedom and common law in that case basically have no statistical impact. And we find that both individualism and economic freedom significantly increase female educational attainment. Democracy and common law have no effect. Maybe you need just a little bit more evidence that individualism or capitalistic values promote women. And so this is my most recent working paper where we look specifically at women's economic and labor rights. And the way that this tends to get measured is if it is in the law. So if you remember back to the beginning, we were talking about kind of those gender disparities, and there are countries that actually have in their legal system, it is a law that women have to obey their husbands. And so what we start doing here is we utilize data that basically have legal gender discrimination based on economic and labor rights. So for example, this is just a really quick overview of restrictions on women's employment across countries, and some of them are quite strange. So for example, in Egypt, women cannot work with fertilizers or insecticides and hormones. In Argentina, they can't distill or sell alcohol. In Angola, women cannot work in gas production. In Russia, women can't drive trains, and there's over 455 other restrictions. You can just kind of briefly look through and see that within the law, there are restrictions about the type of employment that women can have. So we utilize an index of women's economic rights that is basically related to their labor rights, which would have significant influence on their ability to be gainfully employed outside the home. And this index includes both the law, so if it's in the law, and if it gets enforced, which is very important because, you know, and even in our country, we have a ton of laws that are on the books that don't get enforced. So we utilize this index because it includes de jure and de facto women's rights. So for example, what the index captures is if there's equal pay for the same type of work, if you have free choice of profession or employment, you have the right to gainful employment, there's equality in hiring and promotion, if there's job security, if there are within the law non-discrimination practices, you have the right to be free from sexual harassment, and also if you have the right to work at night, or other occupations that are classified as being dangerous. And why that's important is if we think of in economics, we also, we're trying to understand wage differences include compensating differentials. So men tend to hold occupations in more dangerous jobs relative to women. So that can partly explain a gender gap. And so a lot of times what we've been uncovering is that across countries, women aren't allowed to hold dangerous jobs. And so when we now relate individualism to this index of women's economic rights, we find kind of the same type of association. So more individualism, more female economic rights related to labor, related to employment. And so again, this is at the country level. We do a lot of different tests to try to tease out that this is indeed a causal relation. Overall, what we find is that individualistic countries support laws and enforcement of those laws that promote women's economic rights. Individualism has a greater effect on those rights in both common law and democratic countries. So the way that you can think about this is that democracy and common law can serve as a communicating device for values. So if you think about with democracy, it can communicate your preferences and turn that into policy. If your preferences is about individual liberty and rights and it transcends gender, then that should be easier to get into law in democratic countries, and that's what we find. What this also then implies is that by encouraging a country to become more democratic doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get more gender equality. And that is because it is based on cultural norms. So in a country like Egypt that is collectivist, if they democratize, we shouldn't necessarily expect to then see more gender equality. And so in some sense that can be frustrating or at odds with a lot of the solutions that certain groups try to advocate to achieve gender equality. So collectively, kind of think about the initial results looking at the surveys at the individual level and then aggregating those survey questions at the national level and then turning to even a different index, not using the World Value Survey, using a different measure of women's economic rights. We find that individualism or collective or capitalistic values promote gender equality. So again, we're looking at it in terms of education, in terms of employment, in terms of other values related to women. So gender equality, we argue, requires capitalistic values in free markets. So again, if we hear any sort of kind of push or promotion to what we can do across countries, it's usually, well, we need more political freedom. And what our results argue is that you need values that support economic freedom and freer markets. So policies that mandate gender equality or attempt to mandate gender equality may have little payoff if gender-related norms and outcomes are culturally ingrained. So again, when we are starting to see studies that are showing these gender quotas aren't having the payoff that they expected, this is partly and potentially why. And lastly, then maybe you're ready to just throw your hands up and think there's nothing we can do. But recall that a lot of countries have legal restrictions on women. And so one place to start is to just remove the legal restrictions. And so I think that kind of overall, this presents a particular way of starting to think about and understand the gender disparities that exist across countries. Thank you so much for your time, for tuning in and for listening. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's fantastic. And everyone, we are taking questions through the Q&A at the very bottom of your screen. So just submit your questions and we'll read them to Claudia one at a time. First question was submitted early on, so you may have actually answered this. But Christopher Wiseman asks about, can you clarify the distinction between the wage gap and the earnings gap? He says the wage gap is the averages, where the earnings gap is largely explained by the choices and situations where men are more likely to engage in high-risk labor, which is compensated at a higher rate. So
So when economists start looking at basic statistics or then trying to compare women that are making the same choices as a man, or that, you know, they kind of have the same education, same hours in the labor force, that kind of thing, then we don't see any differentiation between overall earnings or even the wage gap.
Thank you. Another question from Protik Nandi. He asked, referring to one of your graphs, do you know what is happening with Singapore? It's more on a collective society. If I'm not wrong on the graph, it's more on a collective society with a high per capita income. Sorry, I didn't catch which slide that was referring to, but one of the slides apparently Singapore stands out.
I'm not sure either. And it was with individualism and income, I believe. So maybe this is one. Yeah. So one thing that is important to remember is the way that we're trying to address measuring culture is using survey data that's been collected, started in 1981 to 2014. We don't expect, and we don't find that culture actually does change that much with these particular questions, but it's also relative. So my kind of understanding of Singapore and countries like Hong Kong is that they would tend to still have certain notions of individual responsibility, but maybe on other aspects tend to be, you know, a little bit more what you would consider collectivist. I don't have a great answer in terms of why that's the case, but their income change has happened relatively quickly. And so it's possible that their culture has not caught up, if you want to think of it that way. So, you know, on average, countries that are more individualistic tend to have a higher levels of growth, but it's not that it's impossible. If, for example, we tend to see those countries become more economically free faster than their culture changes, then we would expect those countries to have higher levels of income. So I kind of think that's partly what's going on there with Hong Kong, but I don't have in-depth knowledge to be able to give a detailed answer.
All right. Our next question is from Rania. She asks if there's potentially a Western bias to equality and the way that it's interpreted and measured across different countries and cultures. One of the points she brings up is in some countries with low skilled labor, it may be fairly normal to have maids or servants in the household. How would that affect the interpretation of equality between men and women?
So I think that's where trying to get at the norms and patriarchal attitudes is really important. So other studies have tried to address female labor force participation or female educational attainment. There haven't been, at least that I'm aware of, very many cross-country studies that get at attitudes to women. So I would argue that picks up more on potentially that effect of you know, basically how you view women's role. So if it is to be inside the household, or you know, do you think that women can be gainfully employed outside the household? However, having said that, in our particular way that we can conduct the analysis, we are basically wiping that out because we do what's called control for country fixed effects. And so that wipes out any effect from that. So on one hand, that's really great, because we are able to identify values in terms of individualism to the outcomes. But again, that's where we were missing some of the country level effects. So I'm not worried about that driving the result, but that as I would say that that's why it's important to understand how cultural norms related to individualism would relate to other attitudes toward women.
All right. Our next question is from John Elkhorn. He asks, how does your research reckon with the distinction between two kinds of individualism, self-interest without guile, Adam Smith Hayek, versus opportunism and corruption? The distinction, he says, seems relevant to economic development. Are there gender differences in the prevalence of these two kinds of individualism?
my understanding in trying to measure values related to individualism is that it's more Smithian and Hayekian in the sense of it's about individual responsibility. And so the consequences from those actions, but it's also about natural rights. And so within that, then I think you have this notion of property rights, and it kind of sets up in the Smithian world. So within a private property rights system, you are self-interested, but there's a check on that. And so even if you are also greedy in a private property rights world, that behavior gets checked by market competition. I'm not sure if there's been any work to try to make that type of distinction. It is interesting to think about, but it would probably be relatively more difficult to tease out because of, again, you can hold values in which you were more greedy, but if you face competition or you are in a freer society, then I feel like that's what's gonna lead to, you not being able to exactly act on that. Versus if you have both, going off, if you have both values aligned with individualism and you live in an economically free country, then that's going to have where we're going to see the bigger payoff.
All right, our next question is from Peter Calcaño. He asks, how do we get people to think more in terms of individualism and economic freedom that promotes gender equality as opposed to political freedom and rights, democracy, which does not necessarily lead to these outcomes?
Hold more events like this. I don't have a great, this is somewhat related to our entire, drive and hope to educate individuals, so to expose them to a different way of thinking, to just bring up an alternative perspective, and maybe they can then start thinking a little bit differently than they otherwise would have. Changing that narrative has always been difficult, to get people to think of markets as being a social space or as being a place where people can behave ethically, or now to be a place in which women actually can engage and promote themselves in ways however they see fit. And so I think that is perhaps the difference between economics and maybe other social sciences, is because we in our core understand that value is subjective. It's still about individual choices. And so if a female decides to not work outside the home, we don't see that there's anything wrong with that. She's maximizing her utility. Whereas in other conversations, you maybe wouldn't have that. That's again where the notions of individualism and rights and choices and freedoms come in. And that's not just related to gender equality, even though it tends to be an area that definitely where capitalism gets blamed.
All right, our next question, economically speaking, what is the biggest, they use the term shocker, that you believe women face every day, but I guess I'm interpreting that as obstacle.
Okay. Oh, well, depends on where you are. So in doing this research, it has been shocking to me that countries in their legal doctrine have things like you must obey your husband. We see this in movies, but it's not something to where you would think that, there's over 100 countries that basically have laws where you can legally discriminate against women, or have laws like, you must ask for permission to drive or to get a driver's license or own a bank account or set up a bank account. Like those types of restrictions, if they can get removed, would drastically change female empowerment. So that to me has been quite shocking.
All right. Lucas asks, and you mentioned this, do you have thoughts on paid maternity and paid maternity and paternity leave? Is there a correlation with individualism?
That's a great question, because what we need to think about is, instead of things being mandated or required, is that's basically an overall compensating package. And so companies, so let's think about Chick-fil-A. So Chick-fil-A is a great example of where they're closed on Sundays, And so in one hand, it restricts the ability for, say, someone who needs to work on a Sunday because Monday through Friday they can't, because they are taking care of kids or taking care of an aging parent. And so on the weekends they could work. Well, basically what happens is people start to sort. And so someone who values being off on Sunday to be able to go to church, for example, those values align with Chick-fil-A, and that's the type of the workers that you get. And so companies can sort based on different types of compensation. And so not just based on wages, but if they want to be able to offer paid paternity or maternity leave or other family leave, then that's fine, but it will affect their pay, or it would affect other compensating things that they would include in that compensation package. And so I think it should be up to each individual firm or corporation to be able to decide how they want to compensate their employees. Maybe they have a daycare there so that parents can very easily check in on their kids. And you're going to see sorting of people who value that versus single people who don't value that. And so I think that's a better discussion to have than mandate. Top-down policy tends to not work. And that it's not that one's good or bad, it's let people choose.
So the next question, is there a possible stickiness to gender rights? So once gender rights are achieved, is it more, even if economic freedom declines, could it be that, once those rights are granted, it's really hard to take them back?
I think this is where norms versus laws come in. And so if it's within a society's norms, then I would argue there's stickiness there for sure. If it's legal doctrine, then, you could, depending on if it's a democracy or autocracy, if somebody else takes over, then they could rewrite the law the next day. But if it's culturally ingrained, that's not going to matter as much. And so I think it just depends on whether or not it's ingrained in your culture or if we're talking about the legal restrictions.
All right, last question, because I know some of these audience members are going to hop over to Carol's lecture in a few minutes. It's from Labania. What about the effect of economic development on individualism and in turn on gender equality in developing economies?
So great question. What's been done in terms of relating development to individualism is most countries are trending to become more individualistic over time, but their relative position hasn't changed. So the US and Western European countries tend to be more individualistic, still relative to other countries like Egypt, but over time they have gotten more individualistic. And the argument there is that's related to economic development and globalization. The modernization question related to gender equality is a kind of huge area of research. Definitely what it tends to show is as you grow, as countries become more developed, there tends to be then more gender equality.
Well, Dr. Williamson, it's been a pleasure having you and getting to see you and hear about your recent research. Audience members, I'm sure she'd be more than happy to respond to any additional questions that you want to email to her. But thank you, and we look forward to hopefully interacting in the future given our proximity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining, everyone. Good night.
Bye.